Strange sound. Good afternoon. Welcome to our Mechanics of the Built Environment. I am Addie Smith-Rem, the Executive Director of the Portland Society for Architecture. I'm joined with our board members, Patrick Booth with Caleb Johnson Studio and Julia Tate with Simon's Architects. They will be facilitating our conversation today. Folks could put themselves, I'm just going to start muting folks here as you come in. We're really glad to welcome Nell Donaldson, Matt Grooms, and Christine Grimando from the City of Portland's Planning Department to talk about phase 2 with the ReCode. The way we'll do this now is they have access to giving a presentation. The best viewing option is if you go into your right-hand upper corner and you select speaker view, and then also make sure you're muted. You can turn your camera off during the presentation, but for questions, clarification, and even discussion, we would love everybody's image back on so we're not staring at a screen. And again, 20 minutes or so, gosh, I'd say 50% have not signed up this morning. So we'll see if you're watching this later, the recorded version. We would have loved your voice for questions, but this is an informative just check-in. So with that, Nell and Matt, thank you so much. Do you need to, let's see, can you unmute yourselves?
Sure, and I think Christine is going to kick us off.
Right.
Yeah, I'll just say
great.
Hello to start us off. Thank you, Addie, and thanks for having us today. So you mentioned all our names, but for the record, Christine Grimando, I'm Director of Planning and Development. I'm really pleased to be here, and I will say, I think I said this the last time, but I have enjoyed this series as a presenter and as a participant remotely and in person. So I think it's wonderful these happen, and I think they bring a lot of value, and it's a pleasure to be a part of it. So as I mentioned, we've been here before. We've talked about ReCode phase 1 before in this forum. And before that, we spoke, well, at least with many of you, not I think in this forum, many of you and as many other people as we could about the city's comprehensive plan. And I think these are all sort of linked initiatives and linked public conversations that we continue to have. And so I'm glad to see this continue. And I'll also just add that Nell Donaldson is our Director of Special Projects. Matt Grooms is a Senior Planner at the department. They're going to lead us off with the presentation, and then I'm looking forward to the discussion. And thanks again.
Great. Thanks, Christine. So I'm going to do the first half of this presentation, then Matt is going to take over and sort of do the second half. And we were here, actually, I was looking at our schedule. We were here in October of last year. So it actually, I mean, that feels like a long time ago in some ways, but it wasn't. It was right at the end of phase 1. And so some of this presentation is going to be a tiny bit familiar to you, and some of it will be all new. So hopefully everybody can see my screen. Can you? Excellent, great. So again, as Christine mentioned, my name is Nell Donaldson. I'm the Director of Special Projects here at the City of Portland. I've been here for a while at the city and have done a bunch of work on the ReCode project. And the ReCode project, for those of you who are not familiar, and even those of you who are and may need a reminder, it is a big initiative on the part of the city that was directly born out of Portland's new comprehensive plan, which was adopted by the City Council in 2017. When we finished the comprehensive planning effort in 2017, we knew that we needed to take a concerted look at our land use code from top to bottom. We knew that the code in some ways was out of step with state regulations and other regulations. We knew that it was long, repetitive, at times confusing for the public for sure, at times difficult to administer for city staff. We knew that parts of it were outdated. There were references to dates that nobody knew the origin of. There were inaccurate references to across parts of the code. And so we knew that the whole thing needed at the very baseline level, sort of streamlining and a refreshing. And that's the work that we encapsulated in phase 1 of this project. We like to say that phase 1 was primarily an administrative sort of organizational exercise to streamline the code. There was some policy work we did in phase 1, and we need to be totally clear about that, but largely it was a mammoth, colossal, reorganized restructuring effort. We also knew coming out of the work of Portland's plan, though, that we also needed to look at the code soup to nuts, top to bottom, from beginning to end, and to make sure that it was really aligned with the vision and goals of the comprehensive plan. This is a matter of state statute everywhere across the state, and country. The land use code is supposed to be aligned with comprehensive planning. And the code had changed over years. We knew this, right? So there is and was progressive policy in the land use code that reflected the way that the city's land use policy goals had changed, and policy goals more broadly had changed. So there was progressive parking policy in the land use code. There in 2017 already, there was progressive transportation demand management policy and affordable housing policy and environmental policy. And there was an impact fee ordinance shortly after 2017. But so there was already good policy within the land use code, but there had not been a soup to nuts look at the land use code for more than 50 years. And so we knew that that was like a critical piece of work coming out of Portland's plan. And that is the work of phase 2. So that's what we're doing right now with the ReCode effort. As you all know, phase 1 was adopted in November of last year, so shortly after we were before you last time, and it was effective or became effective in December. So we've been working under a new looking land use code, at least for about 7 months. And by and large, the response has been positive. We're looking forward to hearing your feedback today. And of course, we have a running list of things we'd continue to like to tweak and refine in the land use code as we move forward through phase 2. So following adoption of phase 1, we stepped right into the phase 2 work. We hired a consultant named Camiros, is the name of the firm, in the late winter, early spring. They're based in Chicago and have done land use code work across the country. So they were responsible for the Buffalo Green Code, notably. They've also done zoning and code work in Providence and New Orleans and Baltimore, and a lot of work in the sort of Chicago metro area, where they're based. And so they come with pretty deep experience in this type of work. And their scope, the scope we're working through with them, includes 2 major components. So the first component is really about evaluating the existing code to see how it is achieving our goals from Portland's plan, how it's meeting the moment in terms of things we're hearing from the public, and we've heard from the public through the Portland's plan public engagement process, as well as through phase 1, and how it's sort of aligned with best practice. The second element of the scope is about actually drafting, reviewing, revising as necessary text and map amendments that allow us to achieve the goals of Portland's plan. And so that's sort of the nitty-gritty technical code work. And their scope includes public engagement sort of throughout. There will be a sort of concerted public outreach and engagement effort after the draft code evaluation is done. And then there'll be sort of punctuated public engagement throughout the drafting and of amendments process. And I should note that we really see this project is about implementing Portland's plan. There was a really robust public engagement process around Portland's plan that really set the sort of high level 30,000-foot goals for what we want our code to do. And so the public engagement through ReCode phase 2 is really designed to be targeted. It's not about rehashing the goals or the vision. It's about the sort of on the ground, how we implement the goals and vision. And so it's really, again, designed to sort of be targeted around the results of this evaluation and then the drafting of amendments itself. So the code evaluation, this is the phase or the step in phase 2 that we are currently in. Our consultant has been working on this for a couple of months, and it's a significant amount of work. So this is sort of the way I see it as a screening of our land use code through the lens of Portland's plan. So identifying what were the goals and policy sort of guidance that we find in Portland's plan. How well is our code actually advancing those goals or not? And then where can we identify weaknesses in the existing code or opportunities to enhance the code to better meet our goals and vision, the goals and vision of Portland's plan. And we think they're probably coming down the line, map amendments that help us better achieve the goals of Portland's plan, as well as text amendments to the code that help us better achieve the goals of Portland's plan. So even while our consultant is focused on that code evaluation, and they've been working on it for a couple of months at this point, we've been doing a lot of work in-house in our office to try to support and supplement their work. So we've spent the last couple months trying to delve into the big topics of the comprehensive plan, and doing our own sort of analysis to help feed the code evaluation. And incidentally, we've been posting some of this work online. So if you've been checking the ReCode website routinely, which I'm sure you all do, you'll see the results of some of this work. And it actually is pretty interesting work that I could see this group getting really engaged in. So we've framed this work around the vision statement from Portland's plan, which is sort of these 6 big concepts that that are sort of guiding for all of or designed to be guiding for all of the city's work. For example, one of the elements of the vision statement is about an authentic Portland. So a Portland that sort of recognizes its roots and reflects its history in all of its work. And so sort of as a component of looking at this element of the vision, we've been exploring old zoning maps and old land use policy in the city. So Christine keeps coming into my office and being like, I think there's an air quality issue in here because you have too many old documents and it smells horrible. But we've been looking at, planning through the 70s, 80s and before, and sort of trying to understand how did we end up where we are right now? Why are there 7 residential zones? What was the idea behind the R1 and the minimum lot size in the R1 and the R2 and the R3? Sort of how did we get to what's written? And similarly, looking at the zoning maps. So this is what you're looking at here is the 1926 zoning map, the first one for the city. There were 8 zones. And obviously now we have quite a few more. Some of that just reflects the march of progress, but it's worth reflecting on sort of what did we gain between 1926 and now, and where should we be going in the future. As an element of looking at the second sort of part of the city's vision statement from Portland's plan around equity, we've spent a bunch of time looking at demographics in the city. So where are our vulnerable populations? Right here, you're looking at a map that shows poverty or proportion of the population in poverty. We've looked at, we're looking at concentrations by race and ethnicity and English language learners. They're looking at concentrations of people with disabilities, and sort of overlaying our zoning on these maps as a way of sort of looking at how access to resources is working, how housing may relate to sort of geographic patterns for populations that we're concerned about making sure have equitable access to resources. We have spent some time looking at the connected element of the vision statement, which, for folks who've read Portland's plan, there's a lot of transportation land use policy in the plan. And this is one way we're looking at sort of the connected concept. Here's a map where we're showing actually employment density, with the darkest areas obviously being the densest areas of employment, overlaid with the region's transit planning, basically. So those red lines are showing areas where GPCOG's transit planning has shown possibilities for rapid transit in the long term. And so here we're doing things like trying to look at employment and population density and seeing how it actually is supporting or not the region's transit vision, and what we might need to do with the land use code and the map to better sort of support the future of transit in the region. There, I'm going to pass it over to Matt quickly.
Thanks, Nell.
Yeah.
So this, so just kind of picking up where Nell left off, this slide kind of represents some of the most well-baked work that we've included here, in part just because a lot of thinking obviously went into Portland's plan around how Portland can be more sustainable and climate resilient. And then One Climate Future, which, as you are all probably very much aware, which is Portland and South Portland's climate action plan, really takes a deeper dive into, discerning what recommendations are most prudent in terms of, how we can actually meet our climate goals. And so this slide really represents kind of the work that was taken from that. There are a number of land use based policies that are called out in One Climate Future that really are pretty far along in terms of their thinking in ways that we can actually reshape our environment to meet our climate ambitions and our climate goals. So for example, reducing vehicle miles traveled. There are recommendations in One Climate Future around transit-oriented development, which Nell just mentioned. So really making sure that people from their place of residence to their place of employment can get from one place to another without ever stepping foot in a car. There are recommendations around TDM, which again, as Nell already mentioned, is something that we have a pretty aggressive policy around, or really ambitious policy around already that's included in our land use code. But that's really about reducing the actual parking demand for a given use and really incentivizing people to get around through other means. So through, biking, walking, taking public transit, telecommuting, really baking that into our process right from the very beginning when we actually intake a site plan application. There are recommendations in there around vehicle electrification, which, as we're all, I'm sure, fully aware, Maine is very much dependent on the automobile. We're a very rural state in nature, and so vehicle electrification is a really important element of our, how we're going to cut down on our greenhouse gas emissions. And that's something that, again, we can talk to through the land use code by really leveraging it to create new infrastructure. So making sure that the actual charging stations are being constructed in enough places and with enough regularity that people feel comfortable making the transition to an electric vehicle. And that's something, again, that we've already actually done as part of phase 1 of ReCode, was introduce new technical standards around the implementation of EV charging stations. And then the last one here is just building resiliency into our infrastructure and our built environment, which is something that I think we like talking about less than some of the other ones, but it's critically important. We understand that our climate is changing. That's having real impacts on our environment. Sea levels are rising. Heat waves are increasing with regularity. And so how do we make sure that we are, taking those factors into account as new development comes online? And so those are things that are talked about in One Climate Future that are being then carried forward through to ReCode as we start actually implementing those policies. Next slide.
Sorry, Matt, hold on.
That's okay.
It is not advancing.
Not advancing. Oh dear.
It's weird. Hold on, let me just do this again, everybody.
I have had this issue.
Have you? There we go.
It just
There you go.
gets stuck, I guess.
There you go.
And again, so I just wanted to clarify and kind of reiterate this, as Nell mentioned, these are not intended, this work that we've done in the last couple of months hasn't really, it hasn't been meant as a comprehensive or fully deep dive into these different elements of Portland's vision statement, but they really are meant to highlight the kinds of thinking that we're doing as we start, really grappling with what changes need to take place in the land use code, and what research and what analysis do we need to do to make an informed decision as we move in that direction. And so this next element, which is dynamic, we decided to focus in on complete neighborhoods. I think we are all aware that Portland has some great examples of complete neighborhoods. If you look at, many areas on Peninsula, including, Munjoy Hill, the West End, East Bay side. Then again, you also have some areas off Peninsula, such as Deering Center, that really have rich access to local services and amenities. And I should take a step back further. When we're talking about complete neighborhoods, what we mean is, having someone have ready, car-free access to the goods and services that we would typically access in a given day. And so we did some research on this to kind of determine where in the city is that access available and where is it not. We pulled out a number of different resource and amenity types. So we looked at medical offices, public open space, schools, grocery stores, libraries, even coffee shops, and then built a walk shed around each of those layers. So a walk shed of 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes to really highlight, where places are walkable, where they're not walkable. And that's really important as we start thinking through what land use policies will help ensure that everywhere across the city, regardless of neighborhood, people have access to these things without needing to get into their car. And so that's some really important thinking that will need to happen as we go forward. And then this last one here on secure, we focused on housing. Housing, as is something that we hear on a daily basis is really important. There's a lack of affordable housing in the city of Portland, and it's something that there's just an overall feeling that there's a lack of access to housing in Portland. And so we wanted to make sure that we are on target to hitting our housing goals. And so Portland's plan calls out that 2,557 new dwelling units need to be developed by 2027 in order to meet the needs of a growing population. And so we wanted to see, well, are we on target to meeting that goal? The good news is yes, that we are. And also, just generally speaking, what types of housing are being developed? What's the composition of the housing in terms of bedroom count, in terms of, general form? Is it single family, two family, multifamily? And really understand how our zoning is playing a role in the housing that is being developed. So this is a look at the zoning. And one thing that's kind of stark and really interesting, based off of this graphic, is just showing the kind of strict bifurcation of the types of housing that's being developed. So the vast majority of new housing that we're seeing is multifamily, and not surprisingly, we're not seeing multifamily in many of our residential zones because they really only permit single family housing. And so, this begs the question: are we encouraging the right array and mixture of housing types across many of our different residential zones? Also, there's this disparity between zones in terms of the type of housing, whether it be market rate or affordable, and how do we encourage, all neighborhoods, all zoning types to really facilitate an equal or equitable, distribution of affordable housing across the city. And then this is just a breakdown of really what percentage of the land area within our residential zones is allowing for permitting certain types of housing. And what's really stark in this, especially when we think about what I just mentioned, in that the vast majority of new housing that's coming online is occurring in multifamily housing, is that only 7% of the land area in our residential zones permits multifamily housing, whereas 33% permits two-family housing, and then again, 100% permits single-family housing. And so we have this kind of clear preference for or supportive framework for single-family housing, and yet it's multifamily housing that is producing the majority of these new units. And so the question then becomes: is that the right mixture, or are there changes that need to be made to kind of, again, more broadly permit other housing types? And so in terms of next steps, as Nell kind of started us off with, we're kind of in the introductory phase of phase two. We are still at this point, we're doing our background analysis on many of these different topic areas. Camiros is still in the process of developing its code evaluation. And then once that is available, there will be a whole series of public engagement events around that document so that members of the public have access to it, can really hear and learn more about the recommendations that are coming out of that document, and have an opportunity to provide feedback before that code evaluation, which really is a roadmap for changes to occur in the future, is kind of finalized and is then used to inform future text and map amendments to the land use code, as Nell mentioned. And so this is where we will leave off and kind of kick it off for a broader conversation. And honestly, this is what we're most excited about in coming to speak with you today. But there's so many, obviously doing the type of work that we've been doing in this research has really created more questions than answers, if anything. And so, and these are questions that we really want to make sure that we are getting right. So for example, we've talked about complete neighborhoods, but what policy changes can we implement that will really help facilitate the kinds of complete neighborhoods we want to see? Is it remapping different areas of the city to introduce new business zones in different locations so that they're more broadly distributed, or is it introducing new uses into our residential zones, allowing for some low impact commercial uses or professional uses, for example, in many of our residential zones? How do we encourage the types of housing that we'd like to see? There's been this long running discussion around missing middle housing that has historically been a really important piece of the puzzle in terms of providing, kind of a rich array of housing types that are available to people. And it's something that's, quite frankly, it's missing in a lot of our residential zones now. And how, if anything, like what steps or strategies do we take to make sure that we are providing the housing that, fits the needs of Portland's residents? And then lastly, again, back to one of Nell's earlier points is, do we, we talk about transit-oriented development, but what policies can we implement to ensure that there's, a sufficiently high density, residential areas and employment areas to support transit-oriented development, things of that nature. So with that, I will turn it over to whoever I'm turning it over to, and we are really excited to hear what questions you have, and hopefully we can have a good discussion on this.
Thank you, Matt, Nell, and Christine. This was great. Patrick and Julia will facilitate any questions. But before I remain quiet and step back, I do want to point out that the Complete City is a project that PSA has been working on since 2017 in partnership with the city. We've been promoting complete neighborhoods for a while. So I just, when the StoryCorps came out, the GIS mapping, we were really excited about it. But there's a lot of rich material in the 2 links that I sent, as well as our continued quest in creating more discussion around what a complete city is, which is complete neighborhoods, complete city, complete region. And so I just need to throw that out there. We're excited, but we also don't want that to be forgotten. So Tim Wells put a question in. I don't know if he is on a loud phone. So he wants to know how the 7% of land allowing multi-unit number was derived.
Question, Tim. So I took data from the assessor and which showed parcel area by zone and compiled by zone. So that what that number represents is every zone that allows multifamily. And I should caveat that, Tim, our code fairly well. It does not include the R5 and the R3, which under certain circumstances, very, very unique circumstances, do allow multifamily.
And I can also add on to that as well, that there are obviously in many of our B zones, we do permit multifamily housing. And so that 7% really is only looking at residential zones that permit multifamily.
Good point, Matt. And it's only, it was only a mainland analysis too. So the tip of the iceberg, just to show you the type of ways we're thinking about residential zoning.
Great.
I have a few questions to add as well. don't mind, I'll jump in as the moderator. But first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It's a hugely ambitious goal for the phase 2. Waiting to feed in terms of the phase 1 and getting people introduced to the process, and now it's kind of getting to the point of the real work involved with the actual changes to the zoning itself. And so I guess my question is just more about like procedure, I guess, in terms of how you expect this to go forward, timeline, and also the engagement of the public, and also how it gets admitted over time. Is it something that you plan to parse on to chunks, or maybe you don't have exact plans for that yet? But just curious about the further elaboration on the process. When might we expect to see the starts of changes to the zoning code to better align with the comprehensive plan?
Great question. $1 million question. So our consultant is still working on this code evaluation, and we're really hoping that we have something to share on that. We had hoped, late summer, it may be early fall by the time that document is ready to go. But there will be a broad attempt to reach the public when that code evaluation is done or is ready in draft form for the public to review it. And what that looks like, depending on where we are, to get, as Addie mentioned at the top of this, right? This is in some ways a great way to reach lots of people, the moment we're in with Zoom and remote meeting, et cetera. But in some ways it's also really limiting, right? So we're gonna have to see where we are at that moment and what we can derive that will be most effective in getting lots of folks engaged. And so my guess is that's like multi-dimensional, the way we reach out to people at that point in time. And then the drafting will start thereafter. And so depending what the code evaluation shows, I think that drafting and review process could look differently, right? So, do we take is there a suite of environmental sort of like a sustainability focused changes that we sort of process in one lump? Or is it all sort of more integrated? I think it will depend on what the code evaluation shows. And the timeline will depend sort of on the extent of the code evaluation, I think, as well. And Matt and Christine, you may want to add on to that. That's not a very satisfying answer. I'm sorry.
I have a follow-up to that then.
Yeah.
Quick question is that I think that certainly it's hugely ambitious, a lot of questions. I imagine there's a lot of great amendments that could be proposed. Is part of the third party's objective is to prioritize things that would be more immediately effective in terms of better aligning with the comprehensive plan. Just curious, because I can see there being obviously there's going to be a lot of scrutiny around every single thing that comes in here, which we would expect, which we would want to have encouraged happen. But to recognize that if there's a priority essentially to what might be most beneficial for the general public to be implemented earlier, rather than in some en masse type situation further down the line.
Yeah, I think at the end of the day, there will be a lot of work that comes out of the code evaluation, and there will have to be some prioritization. Like some of it will by necessity need to come first, and we'll have to use sort of an array of variables to figure out what comes first. We know also that there will be things in the code evaluation or that the code evaluation picks up that will need more work, right? We'll need additional analysis before it could actually be implemented. And the idea is for that evaluation to pick up all of those things and lay out a work plan, as Matt mentioned before. So yeah, there will have to be some sort of discrimination around or some sort of filter put on on the code evaluation to sort of figure out how we work through it over time.
I would just add, I think in our initial conversations with the consultants, we've emphasized whatever is highlighted in their diagnostic doesn't necessarily they don't need to worry about it getting done next year. For instance, if there are things that spill beyond, we'll deal with that. That's part of how we respond and part of how we start to prioritize what is sort of priority in our scope right now for getting that alignment in place. And if there are things that go bigger, we'll take it from there, but we've told them they don't have to be cautious in that. in that regard, because we then will have an opportunity to say, okay, some of this might be on a different track if it has to be, and if we can get it all done in one swoop, that's great. But we're open to some things being spilling over if they have to.
Sure, Eamon?
Yeah, thank you for this great update. And I would say like 95% of it, I think, is going in the complete right direction. You're asking the right questions. I'm really excited about it. The one slide I have questions about is that housing production slide that you go through 2027. And wondering, does that take into account at all the 25% inclusionary zoning piece? Because I think, anecdotally, we've already seen a bit of a slowdown in multifamily housing applications, and we've seen a number of 8 and 9 unit applications, which certainly won't get us to that number unless there's starts raining development all over the city with those little 8 or 9ers. And then on the affordable subsidized side, I think we're going to have a very interesting main housing application cycle coming up in the fall, where we see how that affects the competitiveness of Portland's project. So have you taken that into account at all? And are you thinking about any strategies that might be used to sort of ameliorate that impact on housing production without obviously touching the 25%, because you can't for 5 years?
That is a great question. And I will say, so that slide, what it depicts is certificates of occupancy that have been issued since June of 2017 when the comp plan was adopted and today. So the 25% rule is relatively recent. So it doesn't take into account, for example, projects that are in the pipeline that may or may not have approval or under construction. It really just looks at things that are currently occupied. And we have heard time and time again, like that there have been some impacts, related to, passing the Green New Deal, and that has had an impact on, the type of housing that's being developed, the number of units that are coming in. I think it's still probably too early to tell, what sort of, long-term implications that's going to have, or how we are going to address it. I think it's, the trend has been just now for a couple of months, really. And so I certainly think it's something that we'll kind of keep an eye on and keep revisiting as time goes forward, and just see, really, does that impact the numbers that we're seeing and things like that. But I mean, we've heard anecdotally from a number of developers that that's certainly been there have been challenges associated with developing under that framework.
I'll just jump in to say it's such an interesting question, Eamon, and we have our ideas of where it's going, what the impacts are. We've certainly had a lot of conversations about that with applicants, and seen applications change and things like that. But I think it's too soon for us to put it in the trend line. But that maybe that's worth noting somewhere. There are variables we can't yet know the full outcome or full impact of, for sure, and it's definitely a factor.
I have a question, unless there are any questions from the attendees. I want to prioritize those ahead. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. So one of the questions that I have, well, first I'll say, that overall, I have really appreciated all of the transparency as part of this process, and all of the public outreach that has happened so far, and the multi-phasing of this. And Matt, you did mention the coordination with the One Climate Action Plan, and I recently, and Julie Larry is here as well, also sat as a review panelist for proposed changes to the city's design manual, which is also happening in tandem with this, in terms of streamlining that document to remove, sort of zoning related text, and coordinate between this effort and that effort as well. And that one's interesting, I'll just note, because one of the challenges of that process was that there actually wasn't necessarily the goal of updating the language, but simply better coordinating and streamlining. So that's an interesting sidebar. But I guess one thing that I would ask is, one thing we discussed as part of that process, which I think applies here, is the potential for, as an end user, some sort of guide or highlighting sort of at the end of the process to help us more quickly navigate the differences between what's new and what we have all already become familiar with. And as you've discussed, this is a sea change project. It's going to continue to evolve over time. So I imagine something like that is challenging, but I'm wondering if there have been any discussions or thoughts about something like that and how that might work. And sorry, and the second part of that question is, given that this is going to be such a long-term thing and will evolve over time, I wonder too, if there's an opportunity or any plans in the work for something that helps highlight what Christine mentioned in terms of the decisions you'll be making in terms of which scope to target first, in your priorities, and which things may happen later, but, a reference for people to be able to sort of see where things are in the process and where things, where investigations might be going in the coming years, et cetera. Sorry, that was a lot packed in. I'll let you answer.
I mean, in that question, there's a lot of good suggestions and things, about things for us to remember in the way that we're messaging around the project, and, ways we can use the website to just make sure we're being clear with folks about how we're breaking the work up into smaller pieces as we move forward, if that's the way that this needs to work. Just quickly on the thought of a guide, I think that's really important. We saw that in phase 1. People really wanted to know sort of what was changing. And I think we developed a tool in phase 1, but it was super technical, and I think it covered the bases, but it wasn't necessarily easy for people to grasp onto. I know in Camiros' work in other places, particularly in Providence, there's actually like a zoning guide that actually is like super graphic and easy to engage with, that I've looked at as like a model for like sort of highlighting key elements of the code that people may most interact with, as like an interesting idea around a tool for making the whole thing sort of more legible to the public. So I think we have a consultant who's keen on exactly the type of thing you're identifying, Julia, and it's a great reminder for us to sort of be thinking about how to make it more legible, this whole thing more legible moving forward.
Great. I see Tim has posted another question, which is, how is the housing unit goal derived? To jump back to that discussion.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you want to take that, or you?
Yeah, I can take that. So the housing goal was derived using the projected population of the city in 2027 at 72,000 people, and was based around household size. So I think that the comp plan calls out 2.08 people per, on average per household, and really is just kind of a straightforward calculation of the number of units that would be needed based on that household size to meet that population goal. I don't know if Christine or Nell, if you want to touch on how the population goal was arrived at.
Yeah, the population goal is like an element of the comp plan, Tim, and so it is in the comp plan process, there was a lot of discussion about how the city had grown or declined in population over the years, right? And especially vis-a-vis the rest of the county, and sort of these broader trends that you saw nationwide over the latter half of the 20th century, right? And so as we were developing the comp plan, there was a lot of talk about what a population goal could be based around. And at the end of the day, we based it around a percentage of the population, the daytime population. So the population that's working in Portland. And what we said as sort of a policy statement or a value statement is that people who work in Portland should have the option of living in Portland. So I think the number is actually 75% of the daytime population, if I'm remembering correctly.
And
it's a goal. So again, we're sort of tracking how we're progressing on the housing side of it, and on the population side as well.
Great. I want to give Patrick the opportunity to ask a question, unless there are any further public, or not public, sorry, attendee questions.
Pulling out the HP board, aren't you?
Yes.
Julia?
Sorry.
Yeah, I have a question. I think that first, the graphic that was presented that shows residential zone and the amount that allows for single family, multifamily, two family, that is super helpful in terms of distilling that thing. I had a question in my mind is that I'm trying to think about how much of it is allowed. And it got me to thinking, of course, of what kind of policies other cities might implement in terms of how to best, immediately address the issue of affordable housing. And so, I guess if you're willing to have some candor, or without, saying that it has to be, just maybe personal opinion, but in terms of what the city policies have currently in place, what would be something like, what one thing might you suggest to change in order to meet that? Because in Minneapolis, for example, you abolish single family zoning and you just allow any single family zone to be two family. Do you, but you're also familiar with Portland, would you feel that the public appetite for that would be there? I guess if you had some thoughts on that, but not just on that question, but if there's any other particular policy you think that is hurting towards that goal towards affordable housing for the city.
These are such good, juicy questions, right?
Totally. And honestly, we would love to hear from you on this too. Yeah, Christine, go ahead.
Now, do you want to, I feel like we could all three of us could talk about this for hours. It's a good one. I don't have a succinct answer. I think we're all aware of that, that Minneapolis move. And I think, one of the things I'd say, Nell mentioned that it's not like our old code hadn't been touched in a long time. There actually had been a lot of housing policy changes for the good, I think, over certainly since I've been here. Sort of changes to allowable density, certainly in our business zones and along Forest Avenue, certain corridors, affordable housing bonuses, the change to the R6, which has been sometimes has had some contention, but it also achieved a lot of what it strove to achieve, or is achieving a lot of what it's trying to achieve as far as walkable in-town neighborhoods. And so I think there's a lot of roads to Rome here, but I think one of the things I'll say that we talk about often is, where are our gaps? It's not like we're starting with nothing here. We think certain places are dialed in pretty well, is my sense. But certain places we haven't, areas of the city zones, we just haven't touched them in maybe ever. And so talking about single family neighborhoods, I think the challenge will be, you gotta bring people along with you a little bit on this. I think the council is supportive of creative solutions, which helps us a lot, that they have objectives that we also think are great planning objectives. So I think finding out where those gaps of how are in what we allow where. We often get proposals, looking at how can we achieve greater housing density, particularly off Peninsula, because it's not a one size fits all. We're not taking the zoning for downtown and saying we're just going to plop it down here and it should work because it will create more housing. We have to figure out a way to sort of graduate these things. And certainly saying no single family but duplex is a very gentle, that probably wigged out certain single family homeowners in their neighborhoods, but it's a pretty gentle thing to propose. It's not saying now is 8 stories and very high, and micro units only. It's actually not such a radical proposal, except that I think a lot of people have thought of those sorts of neighborhoods as untouchable. And so I think that sort of public conversation of how to gently, some places not as gently, some places are just entirely appropriate for much more intensive housing development. We've identified those areas, but in the areas we've said aren't necessarily our primary corridors where we're going to really upzone things or look to unlock certain sorts of new development, how do we more gently say that doesn't mean nothing changes here? And how do we kind of let a place start to change into a more sort of in a more graduated way into a more dense area? I think those are going to be the more sort of delicate, nuanced proposals we're thinking about. I think the ADU standards that just passed, it's citywide, you can have 2 per lot. We basically that says, you could say there is no single family zoning in a sense, but it's a little bit through the back door. But it's a great way to have that sort of public conversation of why not a little more here if it fits. And I think making sure it does fit and having a lot of talk about scale and what does it mean and all these things will be really important to the public discussion. So those are some initial thoughts. I think there's, again, we're going to be looking at a suite of things, but I think that's one of the areas that we know is important and will in some ways, even if it's gentler density changes or housing possibility changes we're talking about, will some ways be the more delicate conversations that we're going to have as a community, I think. Nell or Matt?
No, I would just add that I think, there's a use dimension of that. So there's like permitted uses, there's a dimensional dimension of that. And then there's a map element of that. We've spent a bunch of time looking at the zoning map and why were the lines drawn where they were in some places? Because there doesn't seem to be a real break in form where you actually see some of the lines. And again, this is a delicate proposition. Changing the map is a delicate proposition, but gently through a combination of those things, can we create some more opportunity for sort of an incremental increase in housing opportunities across the city is the question.
Yeah, we do a lot of drawing at and staring at maps around here, as we should, but especially lately. And there are places where the R3 changes to the R5, and there is no rational basis, as in where people sort of observing a trend and trying to memorialize it or encourage it. Why the zone break is there? There's no clear reason in some cases, and in some cases there is. Like you can see a line following sort of clear, distinct patterns, and I think that's yes. I'm just adding that map. Looking at the map is one aspect of it, and a fun one. And then there's the question: even if the line looks like it made sense, we can see why it was drawn where it is. Is it encouraging the things we think need to be encouraged? Is that in and of itself a reason to keep it? Are we trying to replicate something? Or are we trying to aspire to something? And the answer will probably vary depending on where we are in the city, but we don't need to be wedded to every zone line and every zone where it is right now, I would say.
I have a
Eamon, did you want to ask your question? You had your hand up and then it came down.
Yeah, I was going to actually ask about some map amendments and how that was being approached, so that got answered.
I had a related question, sort of going back. Is there any consideration in terms of perhaps building in more structure around potential incentives for certain things that would sort of encourage more development in the direction that we would like to see things go? Or I don't know if it's too early to ask that question, pending the analysis.
We get asked a lot. We hear a lot. Well, can we give a height bonus for X or something? And so we have some of these. We have incentives for certain things, but I'd be curious what your thoughts are. I mean, sometimes we're sort of floated. Someone floats the idea of what if we incentivize something, and I like the premise, but like I always approach it as, is there, a nexus for what the bump is, for what's being talked about? So I think it might depend on the use or the thing, but I'd love to hear what you think might be worth that targeting in particular. And also, I think the trickier part for us is always, well, what's the appropriate incentivizing tool? Because if we give the same one for everything we like, at some point, it's just maybe that should be the standard or something.
So I think here the most broadly discussed around sustainability goals and of course affordable housing. creating as many of those units as possible. But I think that your question, Christine, in terms of what is that incentive and how is it wielded, you know, and is it used differently for different targets? I think that would be an interesting, broader question to ask, you know, more of the public. And Addie, I know we're wrapping up, so I'll turn
We
it over
are,
to
and actually,
you.
Tim has a question before we do that.
Oh,
I know
sorry.
everybody has to leave at 1, but I just want to make sure
Thank
Tim's,
you.
Tim, you're up.
Yeah, I was
Sorry.
just wondering thank you, Addie. I was just wondering how much sensitivity analysis you do when you're looking at the R3, R5, or the R6, and you actually look, you know, plot by plot and say what can actually be built in these zones, and what are the economics of doing that, and so what is this really going to spur in development with these different rules? You know, I mean, like, I think the 7% is extremely generous. I think it's more like 2 or 3% when you take into account the historic districts, the contributing buildings. When you really and you take out, like, R6 contains Maine Medical Center. It contains all the highway clover leaves. Well, you got to strip those away. You can't. It's in the R6 and it shows as a percentage of land, but it's not R6. It's not buildable land. And we can't include all the parks. And you have to take the historic district out, the conservation overlay district. All of these things greatly limit all of this stuff in a big, big way. And so when we're looking at this stuff, we really have to analyze it and really get to the real number, not these very, very high level numbers that really don't tell the story. And so I'm just wondering about I have done some of this. It takes a long, long time. You guys with your GIS may have tools that could really streamline this. But we really need, we're flying blind because we really don't have the data and we're not looking at the right data. And so that doesn't help inform us make good policy. That's one of my concerns. So I'm just wondering how much of the sensitivity analysis you've done to derive at some of these conclusions or solutions or recommendations. Thank you.
Yeah, I think those are good points, Tim. There's nuance in the data. There definitely is. And we need to be aware of that. You know, those numbers that Matt showed are really broad brush, right? Very broad brush, but they show you something. And that's where the investigation sort of starts. And then I think we are trying to use whatever tools we have. And our GIS data is decent. I mean, we can't look at things like setbacks through GIS. Unfortunately, we spent a bunch of time trying to figure out whether we can run an algorithm that'll get us to looking at how our built form is lining up against setbacks, for example, right? Like, you know, there's some stuff we can't get through through the existing, you know, technical tools we have, but we're trying to get at them through other means. And recognizing the limitations of those analyses is really important. Figuring out how we can hone them to make them better is also really important. So it's a good point.
The only other comment I'd make is that when you put these things out in presentations, people, especially lay people, who don't understand the nuance, misuse this. The city councilors, who are lay people, do not understand this. They misuse it and they draw the wrong conclusions. Yeah. So when we're putting out this data, it's very important to contextualize it. Because we run and then you can never grab it back. You can never put on the reins. Once it's put out there, it's abused for the next 10 years. And it's dangerous to do it.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a good thing to be aware of too. Absolutely. And we are certainly thinking about that. I mean, I think data can help inform our decisions, but data isn't the be all end all. That's absolutely true.
Great. It is 1 o'clock, so I am, or 1:03 technically. So I'm very cognizant of everyone's time. I'm exceptionally grateful for this. It's, you know, it's definitely the beginning, not the end. There are a lot more questions coming out of this, which is fabulous. I do want to plug that we are testing your ADU policy. We received 33 submissions for the competition with real plots scattered throughout Portland. So various typologies. We're pretty psyched. We have a public exhibition coming up in September of that. But what I actually just sent an email both to Christine and Nell, you know, to Tim's point of how the public interprets information, I think to get ahead of, you know, sort of decontextualizing things or not understanding its context, more public exhibitions on that planning zoning history could be extraordinary, you know, like finding ways to publicly present what is a zoning map. We did this at the Complete City exhibit at UNE, and it was fabulous just to see what these maps were and why they, not even why they were created, they were just there. But I think if you had a why is this line here, that all of a sudden there'll be more curiosity and investment in understanding their own personal zone in a less combative environment, which isn't like your 3 minutes of public comment or understanding. So I think that you guys have, if you're doing all of this work inside and internally and you are questioning your air quality, partner with a gallery or some kind of public exhibition space, because I think that that's going to be the next phase, just getting fluency. Again, Tim is living in this. Most everyone on this call lives in it. And so I think the more ahead of the game you can get with that, the better it is. So again, I'm really grateful. I don't know if we will host our next mechanics event in person or on this very strange format. But this will be recorded and uploaded by the afternoon, so you can share it with friends, colleagues, etc. I'm really grateful and enjoy the rest of the day. I will say, actually, we have the mechanics event in September will likely be on the ADU competition and testing the policy. So that will be the topic. So sorry, you can hear my dog. Okay, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Great.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
so
Addie.
much.
Thanks.